and welcome to a new episode of Talking Law from Women in the Law UK. I'm Sally Penni MBE, a barrister at Kenworthy's Chambers in Manchester, Joint Vice Chair of the Association of Women Barristers and the founder of Women in the Law UK. You can find out more about my work in a professional capacity and the sort of cases I cover in regular webinars covering subjects from vulnerable witnesses to employment law, which are all available to watch again on YouTube. I'm also the author of a series of Talking Law books available on Amazon and the Law and Guidance podcast, a brand new podcast which discusses the law in practice in an attempt to make the law more accessible. Today, I'm talking law in an interview with QC Jolyon Maugham. Jolyon is an Honorary Professor at Durham Law School and is well known for his very high-profile work as the founder of the Good Law Project, which brought a number of legal challenges to the Brexit process to court and a number of recent challenges in the wake of COVID-19. He has had a hugely varied career, and by way of introducing himself, he revealed a rather interesting claim to fame.
Last summer, I ticked off an item on my bucket list, and that item was getting into Pest magazine, the magazine of the pest control industry, in consequence of litigation that we brought against government's decision to award £350 million of contracts, PPE contracts, to a small pest control specialist called PestFix. Less flippantly, I am a QC. I did have an enormously lucrative tax practice. I blew it all up writing about tax avoidance. In the process, became an advisor to the Labour Party on tax policy, and then built a sort of platform on social media which enabled me to bring public interest litigation, which public interest litigation sort of morphed into a full-time job as director of Good Law Project, which I now run.
Fantastic. But you are also a professor at Durham Law School, which is important for sort of our younger listeners. What kind of inspired you to get into law? And then I'd like to ask you about the Good Law Project and the brilliant challenges it's bringing, really.
It was a fairly typical journey, actually. It was born most of a lack of imagination. So I had a slightly odd segue from school to university. I'd been doing secondary school. I'd got my New Zealand bronze medallion life-saving certificate. When I finished school in New Zealand, I came over to England for a year. That was in May 1989. I got a clerical job at the BBC. And one of the advantages or disadvantages, depending on how you look at these things, about being a New Zealander is that you don't really know what your limitations are. And I offered a programme on New Zealand poetry to Radio 3 and a play to Radio 4, both of which were accepted. And that meant that despite my very mediocre academic grades, my bronze medallions I quipped, I was able to get a place at Durham. And initially the place at Durham was to do politics and philosophy. But I then saw some hack legal drama on telly one afternoon. And I thought to myself, this looks like much more fun than philosophy and politics. And so I called Durham Law School, and the admissions tutor there, the long-suffering Francis Pritchard, said, well, if you want to switch from politics to philosophy, we'll need to interview you. So I sort of hopped on the National Express up to Durham. And when I got to Durham, I realized actually this was going to be a disaster because I hadn't actually done any research into what being a lawyer was going to look like. And so I tried to can the interview. I just knew it was going to be a catastrophe. And so I tried to cancel, and Francis had my number, and he said, Jolyon, you're in Durham, aren't you? Yes, Dr. Pritchard. You should come for the interview anyway, as you are in Durham. Yes, Dr. Pritchard. So with sort of long face, I tootled up, and his first observation was, Jolyon, if you want to study law, that's fine with us. Have you got any questions? So I became a lawyer really despite myself rather than in consequence of any long, brilliantly executed strategy.
I really rather like that, because I'm going to ask you at the end about advice to entrance into the law presently and aspiring lawyers, anything you want to tell them. So bear that in mind with where I'm going. Joe, looking at the work you're doing presently with the Good Law Project, it's really impressive and it's challenging and holding account, if that's a way to describe it, the government and what the government is doing or how it operates and so on. But I really want to ask you how that came about, really, the Good Law Project. Should you be in politics as opposed to running the Good Law Project?
Well, I, as I've said, became an advisor to the Labour Party.
Yes.
And in 2015, when Labour thought it had locked up the general election, I was in deep discussions about what post in number 10 I was going to hold in the new government. And then, to everyone's surprise, everyone in the Labour Party's surprise at any rate, Ed Miliband lost the election, which was quite a shock. I do remember going to Brixton Village with my wife on the Sunday and having a drink or two in the evening to try and cheer myself up, the election having been on the Thursday. And after a couple of pints, I sort of had cheered up a little, and I said to my wife, my love, I said, the good ship Maugham will rise again. And she looked back at me and said, Jolyon, you do know you were never actually Attorney General, don't you? So I was sort of slightly at a loose end. I'd already begun to, I wasn't really burning bridges with clients, but I'd already crossed the Rubicon into the public policy sphere from having a pure legal practice. And I was pretty sure I didn't want to go back. So I I continued writing about tax policy. And in fact, I've never had the influence since that I had then. I remember blogging about Facebook's accounts and getting a call. This was in the, it was 2015, I suppose it must have been. This was when Margaret Hodge was making lots of noise in the Public Accounts Committee about tax avoidance. And I got a call immediately. I put my blog up from the BBC World at One. Will you come in and talk to us about Facebook's accounts? And then in the cab on the way to the BBC studios, I got a call from Facebook saying, we think your blog means X and the Labour Party thinks it means Y. Will you change it so that it's clear that it means X? And I got off that call and I got a call from the Labour Party saying, Facebook thinks your blog means X and we think it means Y. Will you change it so it's clear it means Y? And then I got to the studio and I did my interview. I thought, my God, this is such power. Then Brexit.
Yes.
And I was shocked and not shocked. I had watched the TV debates and I had seen the energy and excitement around the Leave case that Remain never generated. And so I was not surprised by the result, but I was shocked. And I felt then powerfully, and I feel now powerfully, that it was the wrong thing, is the wrong thing for us to do. But I suppose as a lawyer, I responded by asking the sorts of tedious recondite questions that lawyers ask about whether process has been followed, what the governance of Brexit is, what doors should legitimately be locked and what doors really ought to be kept open, how the decision-making should be split between a government, then a majority, later a minority government, and Parliament. All of these questions are questions that I went on to litigate. So I think only 3 days after the referendum, I read a very compelling blog by some public law lawyers, and that blog became Gina Miller's case. I crowdfunded for it alongside, initially before and then alongside Gina. And then the Whiteman case, where we established, in the face of opposition from the British government, from the EU Commission and the EU Council, that the Article 50 notification could be unilaterally reversed by the United Kingdom if it wanted to.
Yes.
Of course, we now know never did.
Mm.
And then the prorogation case, and also litigation around whether or not the Prime Minister would be forced to send the notification that the Benn Act, so-called Benn Act, mandated, asking the EU for an extension. He said he'd rather die in a ditch, and then sent it anyway, and has not died in a ditch. And all of that stuff was possible, I suppose, because of having built a platform on social media.
Yes.
With the tax policy work, and having crossed a Rubicon so that I wasn't going any longer to be worrying about what my clients thought of the political work that I was doing. And I suppose just being at heart a New Zealander who doesn't know what he can't do. Too stupid to have worked that out. And so I carry on making the assumption that I can do things. And sometimes it turns out that assumption, contrary to what my elders and betters tell me, that assumption is right. So it's a sort of odd collection, really, of happenstance and personal pathology and ignorance that has caused Good Law Project to thrive. Your question was about politics, though. And I did toy with that for a while. There was a time when I was a sort of darling of the Labour right. And I had at the time also very good relations with John McDonnell. And I remember going in to see John McDonnell, who was very keen that I throw my hat into the ring to be Labour's candidate in Tooting when Sadiq Khan became London mayor. And I thought quite seriously about that. John McDonnell was very keen on the left of the party, and I knew I had the trust of the right of the party as well. But in the end, I decided not to. And I think that was the right decision. One of the reasons why Good Law Project is prospering, flourishing, is because people sense that actually Parliament has become something of an empty vessel politically. It has, surprisingly for a constitution that talks about the supremacy of Parliament, very little to do, very little power. And I feel as though I have much more influence, and I certainly have much more freedom doing what I do now than I would as an MP, even a front bench shadow cabinet minister in the Labour Party. We have freedom at Good Law Project to say what we want to say, to follow the causes that are dear to our hearts, and to pursue them in ways that are unflinchingly honest. And I think in consequence of that, feel quite authentic to people.
Yes.
So your listeners won't know this, but for the first 2 months of this year, our income annualized is not much short of £10 million. So we've already become the largest legal charity, or not-for-profit at any rate. We're not a charity in the country, and we're continuing to grow quite quickly. All of our funding comes from small donors, which means we don't need to be looking over our shoulder at what our funders think. We have freedom, and with that, as I say, comes a kind of authenticity of voice that I think is quite lacking in the public space at the moment.
Yes. It's really interesting and well done on at least revenue. One of the things I wanted to ask you is the use of social media, because when I speak to students and undergrads, they always ask about social media, and the bar standards are very clear about how the bar should be using social media, and they're hot on it. And my question is, when did you become comfortable using social media?
Well, I think you have to have a pretty clear idea in your mind about why you're using social media. Otherwise, you won't use it successfully. So initially, I found Twitter an incredibly powerful place to gather intelligence about my particular practice area, which obviously was then tax.
Yes.
And doing that on social media, I was very, very comfortable using my professional title. I was engaging as a barrister. And then when I began doing tax policy and talking about tax policy on social media, I was using Twitter not to gather intel, but to disseminate my own views of the tax policy space. And that too was incredibly powerful. So it was through that work that I came to the attention of the Labour Party. And indeed, I met David Gauke, who was then the Financial Secretary to the Treasury, and established a very good working relationship with him when he was the Tory FST in charge of tax policy. And I believe, it's an evidenced belief, that I had some impact on Tory tax policy during the second Cameron administration. So social media was very powerful there, and it was, and this is, I think, is what I really love about it. It was incredibly democratizing. I didn't need a newspaper column. I didn't need wealth. I didn't need celebrity. Through the quality of my writing and my analysis, I was able to reach a very, very wide audience. I now use social media differently, and I'm trenchant on social media. Certainly, I'm trenchant about those with power. And that is an activity that is not the activity of a barrister. It has no connection with my professional status. And some time ago, I decided that although obviously I am a QC, I would no longer use those letters on social media. And indeed, that was part of the same decision-making process as my decision to leave Chambers. I was no longer doing a barrister's work. Yeah. So I think the answer to your question is you just need to know why you are using social media, what it is that you want from it. And once you've answered that question, it becomes possible for you to identify what the proper limits of your use of social media should be.
Yes, interesting. As we record this, is that, of course, all the information about David Cameron and his lobbying of Greasehill, and also other things going on. We're still in COVID-19, but one of the cases being brought by the Good Law Project, it is the deal for antibody tests done with Aberdeen Health, where the government suppressed reports that raised concerns around the effectiveness of the tests and so on. It appears, on paper anyway, that it ignored its own legal advice. And my question about that really is this. Do we need to be holding the government to account, given we're in a pandemic? They would say they're trying to do their best to balance all different factors. And so does the Good Law Project need to bring these cases to challenge that? What is the role for the project in doing that?
Well, I think the answer is a fairly boring, recondite lawyer's answer about process. From good processes, from solid governance, good outcomes emerge. Without governance, without proper process, you're much less likely to get good outcomes. So what we know about Abingdon, taking that as the example you gave, is that we spent many tens of millions of pounds on buying antibody tests from a company with links to the government's own scientific advisor. We spent that money despite the fact that the company hadn't got any antibody tests and there were others who had them. We know that government suppressed evidence showing that those tests were not going to work. We know that the contracts were entered into in the face of internal legal advice given to government, and indeed advice later confirmed by government's external legal advisors, that was reported by the Mail. And we know that the tests don't work and that government has stopped commissioning from Abingdon. And I think that story tells you why governance is important. This is not private money that we're spending. This is public money that we're spending. And it's important because it's public money that it be spent in pursuit of the public interest rather than, as in some of these cases, I believe, at any rate, in pursuit of private interests.
Yes. Yeah. Well, very well put. Actually, Joe, can I ask you sort of move on a bit and ask you about well-being? I'm quite passionate about trying to avoid burnout, and having been Silk for all these years, which will involve long hours, hard work, many weekends gone, and so on. I wondered, now you're in a slightly different sphere, how you maintain to have some semblance of wellness and well-being. I don't know if you read or you're a mammal, out on the bike, cycling in Lycra. My research hasn't shown that, but I just wonder how you're keeping well, both mentally and physically.
I'm very pleased, Sally, to hear that your researchers have uncovered precisely 0 photos of me in Lycra. They would not be a good sight, I think it's fair to say. I mean, for me, my mental health it's really important. It's, I guess, the most difficult thing I do, and the most important, because unless I do that well, I can't do anything else. And for me, I guess I draw my mental health from my family. I have a extremely good and loving marriage. I have 3 kids who support the work that I do and are interested in it and engaged by it. I mean, they're young. My youngest just turned 10 yesterday, and my oldest is only 14. But they're politically engaged and they're interested, and they like what I do. So I think it comes from them, and it also comes from a sense that you have when you become older of allowing things to be as good as they need to be, rather than always perfect. And that's the message that I try to give to my kids, actually. I say to them, look, at school, you're always going to be told you must work hard at everything all of the time. And that's rubbish. I say to them, work out the things that are important to you, work hard at them, ignore the other stuff, just do the bare minimum, accept that there will be times in your school career when you'll need to work incredibly hard, and allow yourself at other moments to cruise through and be happy and balanced. And I mean, that's a rather odd message to give to your kids, but by telling them that you're content for them to cruise on some occasions, you win the right to be heard by them when you tell them, in respect of other occasions, that they have to work incredibly hard. And I mean, that at least is how I manage my life. It's by working out what I really, really do need to work hard at, and what I can just go a little more lightly on.
Yes, I was taking a note, actually, because it seems to me quite good life lessons for the bar, and the vast amount of people who listen to this podcast not at the bar or in the profession as solicitors or otherwise. Well, finally, Joe, I know you've got to go, but I wonder if I can ask you, what advice would you give perhaps the younger you, or just young people who are aspiring to coming to our profession as solicitors or barristers or clerks? They're called paralegals now, aren't they? What advice or tips would you have to give them?
To those who are studying law, I think I would say that becoming a good lawyer it's a sort of process of a kind of enculturalization. You have to become a lawyer in your head. You have to learn to think like a lawyer thinks. And that is a process of acquiring a culture of enculturalization, as I put it. And the best way to do that actually is not by reading textbooks. It's by reading case law, because then you are steeped in how and where and why the law is made. So try and make time every day to read one or two cases, and don't read them for the ratio. Read them from the first words to the last and try and understand everything that is happening in that report. That will mean that you acquire less legal knowledge, because you won't be reading the 8 ratios that you might have read had you done a different exercise. But it will mean that you become a better lawyer. You'll acquire the skills that enable lawyers to succeed. And to those who are already lawyers,
Yes.
My advice, I think, would be to remember what you want, not to be trapped by other people's notions of success. I mean, I am contacted from time to time by young lawyers, by those who've been offered training contracts at, magic circle firms, or, barristers who are young and in successful practice. And they say, I'm not sure whether I should go through with this. The world is sort of falling down around my ears, and this doesn't seem to me to be an activity that has much social value. Shall I throw it all in and, will there be a job for me, a good project? And I always say, actually, no. Do your training. Take the benefits of what you acquire in your early years of practice.
Yes.
The trick is not to allow your expenditure to increase as your income does, because then you become trapped by the need to earn a very substantial income, trapped into pursuing a life that the younger you would not have wanted, and the mature you probably doesn't really want either. Living with less money is surprisingly easy. I think, as a tax silk, you're extremely, I was going to say well paid, I mean overpaid, really.
Fortunate.
Fortunate. Director of the Law Project, you earn the salary of a backbench MP, which is about 80 grand. But I don't find that having less money has a material impact on my personal happiness or sense of satisfaction, engagement with the world. Don't be trapped by your income.
Yes. I suppose it's a bit different, though, if people want to go, for example, into publicly funded work, which I do, have done for, 20-odd years. But the debts that they accrue now before they even start makes it difficult, doesn't it? So I suppose it's a balancing exercise. Can I ask you if you're a keen reader? Women in the Law, we have a book club. I wondered if you have a favourite book. It doesn't have to be law related. And maybe a favourite fictional lawyer.
I think the book that gives me most ongoing pleasure and that I come back to is probably Earthly Powers, Anthony Burgess's masterpiece. All of human life, all of its horror and its mystery is in that book. But I don't read as much as I used to. I guess I don't really have the time. I mean, I did an MA in modern literature as an escape from legal practice about 5 or 6 years into my practice as a tax lawyer. I have loved reading. I have loved Beckett in the past. Funnily enough, legal inspirations in fiction, it probably is Tom Cruise and A Few Good Men. That scene at the beginning where he's in the baseball cage and he's hitting the balls, and he works out that they've come to him because they desperately want the case to settle, and it dawns on him that means something quite important about the case that he has, is a lesson actually that resonates for me. I am often in a position where the easy thing for Good Law Project to do is to settle a case. And I have to remember that it's not actually about getting a win, in inverted commas. It's about changing things.
Yes.
And I do draw inspiration from that batting cage at the start of A Few Good Men.
I love that, because most people actually tend to think of the courtroom scene with Jack Nicholson, don't they?
That's right. You want the truth, you can't handle truth. I mean, I like that bit as well, to be honest. But no, it's the earlier bit actually that I find that does contain a lesson for me anyway.
Yes, no, and I think it's spot on. It's a bit like employment cases that I do, that I call them point of principle cases. It's often not about the remedy, actually, for the individuals. It's about the process and bringing that case into public knowledge. Can I squeeze in one last question? And the question's about diversity. I'm always very keen for us to try and improve, and that's kind of what this podcast is about, really. What do you think about diversity? How can we do better?
We need to do a lot better. I sat on the Quality and Diversity Committee of the Bar Council for 5 or 6 years.
Yes, I saw that.
Subcommittee looking at the retention of women at the bar. I was writing about, I was blogging about how few, to use the nomenclature of it's on the judiciary.gov website, I think. There were only 4 full-time Black British judges in the whole of England and Wales. Just a shockingly poor number. I'm not persuaded that things are meaningfully improving, actually. I would align with those like Sadiq Khan who have called for positive discrimination. And I would align with those like Sadiq Khan because I recognize that the law is a human instrument to which judges bring their own preconceptions of ethics, of right and wrong. And that if our judiciary comes from a narrow social strata or a narrow realm of human experience, be it ethnicity or gender, ability or sexuality, whatever it is, the effect is a very conservative one. The effect of creating law in the mold of a very narrow section of society is to have a law that reflects the value judgments of that very narrow selection of society. And that very narrow section of society's value judgments are often wrong. And that really, really matters. I mean, I've done a lot of work in the last couple of years around trans rights.
Yes.
And that made me very, very aware of that which I imagine most, Black men and women in the country knew before I, always slow, worked it out, which is that there is a vast amount of injustice everywhere. And that injustice is perpetuated by an overwhelmingly white, privileged, upper middle class judiciary. And so I think diversity matters for me in particular for that reason.
Yes.
Without diversity, the law is illegitimate.
Wow. Gosh, I think that might be my quote to accompany this podcast when it goes out. The final thing is, I absolutely love New Zealand. When I was there, I spent a lot of time doing bungee jumps, but that's another story. And enjoying the country and the culture. And I wondered if you ever went back at all. I know we can't presently, but whether you ever holidayed there at all.
Yeah, I went back all the time when my kids were younger. When my grandfather was still alive, he died December 2019. He was 100 and almost 101.
Wow.
We haven't been back since the pandemic, and my mum and father still live there, and I miss them and New Zealand very much. Yeah, it has been difficult not being able to go back.
Absolutely. Well, Joe, thank you for spending quite a long time with me. What's next for the Good Law Project?
Well, we have a whole run of procurement litigation in the next couple of months. We're awaiting decisions on Public First. We've got a sort of 6-day trial on our PP procurement cases. And there is an awful lot more in the frame. We're bringing litigation to challenge the so-called misnamed Levelling Up Fund, spending on political advertising of public funds. There is much to do, I'm afraid. Yes. I wish there was less.
Yes, well, we will watch this space, and I hope you'll perhaps come back to talk to me, actually, about some of these in slightly happier times post-pandemic. Thank you so much, Jolyon Maugham. I'm really pleased, and thank you for spending your time talking law with me, Sally Penni.
Thanks, Sally. That was a lot of fun.
A big thank you to Jolyon Maugham QC for talking law with me today in this interview. I'm Sally Penni MBE. You can find and follow me at Sally Penni1 on Twitter, or do connect and follow me by searching Sally Penni or Women in the Law UK on LinkedIn. Please do share the podcast with anyone you think who may enjoy it, from aspiring lawyers, barristers or solicitors, to colleagues and friends in law or in business. Bye for now.